As leaders face greater uncertainty, the consequences of their judgment and decisions become ever more significant. In this show, we're talking to the author and neurologist Robert Burton, whose book, On Being Certain, made a powerful impact on us a decade ago. A profound insight from his work is that certainty is not a rational process, but in fact a feeling. A feeling of knowing that ranges from an intuitive or gut feeling to an aha moment of absolute rightness. Alongside our other neuroscience guests, Robert's work can help leaders to build a more powerful judgment mindset.
Hi, folks. Welcome to the Evolving Leader Podcast. I'm Scott Allender.
And I'm John Gomes.
How are you feeling today, John?
Well, I'm beside myself with joy because I read our guest's book just over a decade ago, and it was fascinating, and it opened up all sorts of perspectives for me. And then I had a conversation with Robert a few weeks ago, and I was buzzing for days as a result of it. So I'm feeling very excited. How are you feeling, Scott?
I'm feeling good. Spring is springing. I'm halfway vaccinated at this point. I'm feeling really creative and hopeful and just in a really good place as we jump into today's conversation. And as you say, today we are joined by author and neurologist Dr. Robert A. Burton. Dr. Burton graduated from Yale University and the University of California at San Francisco Medical School, where he also completed his neurology residency. At age 33, he was appointed chief of the Division of Neurology at UCSF Medical Center at Mount Zion, where he subsequently became associate chief of the Department of Neurosciences. His books include On Being Certain, Believing You Are Right Even When You're Not, which we're going to speak with him a lot about today, as well as A Skeptic's Guide to the Mind, What Neuroscience Can and Cannot Tell Us About Ourselves, as well as 3 critically acclaimed novels. He's also written essays, book reviews, op-ed pieces for New York Times, and is an all-around underachiever. Welcome to the show, Dr. Burton.
My pleasure.
Can we begin with your story, where your career began and how you became interested in the topic of certainty?
Truthfully, I think my interest in it began at an early age when I could never really understand why it is that people had firm opinions. And I'll give you an example just for when I was a kid, they tried to enlist me for the forensic department of the debate team in high school. And they said, go do this debate. And they gave us a question. And I saw both sides of the answer. So I gave both sides of the answer. And the debate guy said, you can't do that. You have to either choose one side or the other. I said, but both sides have a good point. And he says, well, you can't do that. That's not the way things work. And people don't have those kind of opinions. And I said, well, I do, because I don't feel that any one of them is particularly right. And I recognized early on that I seemed to not understand why people felt certain about things. And then I met people, like even within your own family, people seem to hold very strong opinions. And I never had that sense of strength of opinion. So I always wondered, why was it that some people felt certain and others seemed comfortable with ambiguity and not a firm endpoint? And from there on, when I went into neurology, obviously I was influenced by people like William James and so on, where you recognize that there are certain states of mental functioning that seem to be outside your own control, such as mystical experiences. And as a result, first in college, I recognized that there was something beyond your control about major league emotions and feelings, and that one of them was the feeling that you were right. And from then on, it was just a matter of time before I gradually started to see the connections once I went into neurology. People that would have clear idea that there was something amiss in their logic, but they couldn't overcome a more basic feeling that they were in fact correct. And you saw myriad examples in clinical practice. And I saw this even when I was a young trainee in neurology, people that would lose their body self-image. For example, if you have a stroke in the right parietal region, you lose the sense that you own the left side of your body. And you would show them their arm, and they would, on the one hand, know it was their arm because they could move it. But on the other hand, they say, it's not my arm, and they could not shake the feeling that it wasn't theirs. And I recognized that there was some disconnect in the human mind between knowledge as we think of it and the felt knowledge, which is how we experience it.
So it's been over a decade since you wrote On Being Certain, which was a bit of a blockbuster. To help level set our listeners, can you give us a high-level synopsis of the book, particularly this sense of this feeling of knowing and certainty?
I think perhaps the easiest way would be to just think of an aha. If you think about experience in general, when you do something, you have a sense of complete lack of knowledge of whether it's right or wrong, a very modest sense it might be right or wrong, which you might call a gut feeling or a hunch. And on the other extreme is the aha, when you suddenly experience that's right. All of those are gradations of an experience that you have in your own mind, whereby your brain generates the sense of rightness or feeling of knowing. And that feeling can be generated involuntarily. They can do it, for example, in patients who are conscious, who are having brain surgery, in which you can stimulate the brain. And even in the absence of a thought, people have a sense of knowing. So they can feel that they know something, even though it's not attached to anything specific. So it can't be a logical conclusion of, yes, that's right, because there's no that for which it is right. And that is the sort of mystical experience writ large. It's where you feel one with the world, et cetera, but it's the cosmic sense of knowing. Well, that is part of what I would call a panoply of mental sensations that your brain generates for you to navigate the world. It generates a sense of agency. It generates a sense of self, and it generates a sense that what you're doing is right or wrong. So the main point of the entire book really is that these feelings are involuntary, but even though they're completely involuntary, they feel as though they were well thought out, and therefore they are conscious decisions. It's the discrepancy between how we experience involuntary sensations as rational decisions. It's really the heart of how you think about rationality.
What would you say, and your thoughts on the kind of evolutionary purpose of that? How does that serve us positively?
Well, if you think about it, imagine you're going to do a long-term project, like write a novel or do a science project. You have to believe you're on the right track or you'd never do anything. So you have to believe that you're on the right track in the advance of any knowledge that you're on the right track. So it is really the necessity of a reward system, which is how this works, a reward system that rewards something in advance of knowing whether or not it's justified by the reward.
Yeah, you talk about this double-edged single-mindedness and how the brain has developed the capacity for long-term thinking. Just say a little bit more about how you came to and understand that.
Well, for me, I think there's a very strong recognition that you don't really know what you're thinking. At the same time, you know exactly what you're thinking. In other words, most thoughts pop into your head. You wake up in the morning having put something in your mind before you went to bed. It shows up, and then it not only shows up with an answer, but it shows up in the sense that it's right. And so what I sort of envisioned early on was that in our unconscious, and I don't like to use the word unconscious in the way that Sigmund Freud did exactly, although parts of it are correct, but in subliminal brain mechanisms, there's a constant generation of ideas, thoughts, and a simultaneous calculation that thought is correct or not correct. And you experience both as though that is you thinking about this and then deliberating on it, because that's the way the brain works. But that's not, in fact, what has happened. Is it's generated it spontaneously, and then you experience it in consciousness.
So there's been, quite a growing momentum in neuroscience studying this area. And it must be very gratifying to see people like Lisa Feldman Barrett and Mark Solms and others who are creating more of the evidence behind the ideas that you had in your book. How's your thinking developed in the subsequent years as a result of the work you've been doing since then?
When I wrote my second book, Skeptic's Guide, I tried to figure out what the role of consciousness was. Now, everybody agrees that the vast majority of what we do occurs unconsciously. and then it's experienced in consciousness. The question is, does anything occur primarily in consciousness? And I thought, first of all, there's no way you can study that. And second of all, I thought, over the intervening last 10 years, originally I thought, oh, well, consciousness is like a symphony conductor. He's not absolutely making the music. He is waving his arms and music occurs. And if he were to leave the room, there would still be music, unless the guys quit on him. But assuming that they would still be able to play without him, and I thought, what is the role of a conductor in the symphony? Well, he makes choices, maybe, and maybe he is influencing them in some subtle way. And I thought, but maybe this is just our imagination, because you hear lots of people, lots of orchestras without a conductor, they play perfectly well. So I thought, so when I originally wrote this, I was trying to give some residual sense that we have a conscious component to our thoughts, but I can't think of how that would work. For example, if you learn anything, you learn through very simple things becoming more complex. You take your first step, you learn how to play a scale, and then you learn to play a little passage on the piano, but each one of these is influenced by your teacher, by your parents, or whatever. There isn't any spot down there that's free of having contributed unconsciously to the building blocks of thought. So I thought, okay, so now imagine you have a thought, whatever that thought is. Well, where did the words come for the thought? The words for the thought came from your unconscious. They don't arrive de novo. There's nothing that occurs in consciousness without antecedents in learning. No matter what it is, no matter even the most brilliant new creative idea, flash that you might have, occurs out of a new association between old learned networks in which they're combined in a new way. And then you experience that as a new thought. So then more and more, I think since in the last 15 years, since I started that first book, I've become less and less convinced that there's any role of conscious thought whatsoever. Now, some philosophers refer to consciousness exclusively as an epiphenomenon, whereas other people still hold out some residual paradoxical thought. For example, one of the heads of psychology at Yale has made the interesting comment, because I half believe it and half don't believe it at the same time, is that we do not have free will, but we're capable of conscious, rational deliberation. Well, that sounds paradoxical, but what it amounts to is you experience yourself as making conscious, rational deliberations. And one of those rational deliberations is that you don't have free will. Makes absolutely no sense, but it's the sort of state of modern philosophy when you try to answer questions. The idea that we are capable of conscious, rational deliberation is an expression of how we feel about how we make thoughts, even though it's inconsistent with what neurobiology is telling us. And it's the same reason that even though we recognize that we do things based upon how the brain generates these phenomena, we still believe in free will because we experience free will. The irony is that this sense of agency is itself an involuntary sensation. And so it's paradox upon paradox. So if you've asked me, what have I learned in the last 15 years, more and more, I think I'm beginning to learn that we are all individual neural networks in which we generate the narrative of ourselves. And that is idiosyncratic and not approachable through reason. Introspection doesn't get you there because we can't know how our brains work. And we can't experience what other people experience because it doesn't feel the same. Things don't feel the same to us. We feel different about virtually everything. And perhaps in recent times, given the disasters I see going on around the world, I'm beginning to think that maybe the only real hope for civilization is that we kind of recognize that we all have individual operating systems that are mutually incompatible, and that we can't judge the good and the bad quite the same way we think we can, even though at the same time, we still have to have standards for what's good and bad. But we have to have a new way of thinking about how to approach that.
So speaking of disasters going on around the world, I'm curious, is there a correlation between the feeling of knowing and the brain's desire for certainty? Or I guess what I'm thinking about is, the polarization in politics, for example, in America. Both parties, if you're on far left or far right, I'm sure, are experiencing a feeling of knowing that their position in the world is correct. And there's can almost be a real stubbornness about being open to any new data that might contradict that. Is that a desire, consciously or unconsciously, for the brain not to want to have to move away from that good, rewarding feeling of knowing?
I think it's certainly a large part of it, but I'm not even really sure anymore that I understand motivation. For example, what you suggest and I wrote about was the idea that the feeling of knowing is mediated by the reward system in our brain, and it's as strong as the reward systems for cocaine and alcohol addiction, et cetera, and gambling and so on. And that's true, but it doesn't tell you the underlying reasons why you feel certain in the first place. In other words, if you're fearful of someone taking away your gun rights for whatever reason, and you're certain that this is wrong, that alleviates the fear. So it's not just that certainty is the be all and end all of explanation for why people do what they do, but it's the common final pathway, so to speak. In other words, it might be some underlying motivation. And when I see what's going on in America, for example, there are lots of reasons why people on both sides feel the way they do. And then they enlist the feeling of certainty unconsciously in order to substantiate their underlying feelings, which might have a wide variety of causes, many of which are opaque to the person who's experiencing pro-guns would recognize that they're fearful. They may not recognize that experience at all. They may not just say, the Constitution says we need to bear arms, and I'm certain that's right. So they may argue for certainty. At the same time, I might say that underneath it, there are other more basic precipitating factors, but the final common pathway is certainty. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does.
Well, I just wanted to dig into that for a moment, because I think when we use the word feeling, most people immediately go to thinking. And what you're talking about here is that what's driving that sense of certainty is not a thought process. It's more of an emotional response, or a feeling, or even a physical feeling of physical safety. And I'd be really interested, to get your thoughts. This podcast is about helping leaders think about the future, and your childhood self in that debating society had the capacity to hold opposing ideas and not make an arbitrary binary trade-off.
Right.
And when you think about how emotions play into that, it's very comforting to choose a position. It's very comforting to arrive at certainty, even in the face of there not being sufficient facts. So can you tell us a little bit what you've learned about in yourself, and what you think you've learned that could be applicable to leaders as we moving forward in the world that's becoming ever more complex, challenging, uncertain, and so on, about about the role of emotions in certainty?
Let me back up and maybe approach it from another point of view. We tend to experience thoughts, and because we experience thoughts in the form of language, we think that thoughts are language. But there's no evidence that that's correct. And if you think about this, and it's probably one of the reasons why there's been such a disregard for the animal kingdom, is that we tend to think that we're the only species capable of conscious thought, because we use symbols and language as the basis for making that judgment. But in fact, if you watch animals running around and whatever doing, they're thinking perfectly adequately without language. If you watch young babies who have no language, they're still learning like crazy, even when they have no language. So we use words as though they are the basis for our thoughts. And if you remember, Wittgenstein said, all the problems of philosophy boil down to problems of language. But you might reverse that and say that all the problems of language boil down to problems of philosophy. And one of them is really this idea that emotions are a special kind of situation. For me, in other words, if the brain were to generate a feeling of apprehension, we call it apprehension because we use that word. But if you take Lisa Barrett Feldman, she will argue that you use the words after the fact to describe what occurred. And one of the ones that I think is most interesting is there's a situation in mostly in young women, but not all, only young women. It's called supraventricular tachycardia. Supraventricular tachycardia is when your heart rate speeds up for no apparent reason. But you can only catch it on a monitor if you do it for an extended period of time. It may take weeks or months on a monitor before you catch the episode, because it's fleeting. Most of these people are diagnosed as being anxious. And why are they anxious? Because these people describe their heart rate speeding up for no apparent reason. And then they try to check it out and there's nothing there. And so they say, well, you're just an anxious young woman. Mm. And then if you study it long enough, you find out, well, wait a minute. It wasn't what they thought was anxiety was a physical sensation of the heart speeding up. Well, and now if you back up from that and say, what about emotions in general? We have language for them. I wrote a piece for the New York Times years ago about people who said they were depressed, and how many different variables go into the description of the word depression. Some people are depressed because they don't win the lottery, and other people are depressed for no apparent reason and are suicidal. Those are not the same thing. They're fundamentally different feelings. One's frustration and the other is despondency. But because language is at the core of describing these, we describe emotions according to how we experience them. So when you say, well, what could you advise people? I would say somehow you need to stand back from the common everyday parlances. And every time you use a phrase, you say, what did I mean by that? And you give some more time and energy and insight into thinking about what does it mean when you say someone is frustrated, depressed, when you understand, or anxious, when you can understand that in other circumstances, you might give the underlying explanation an entirely different set of valences. You follow me?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that most people fall back on the tried and true, because tried and true is the way they learn. And so tried and true is what feels good. And so it's natural that even when if you're trying to give advice to corporate leaders, they will listen to you only to the extent that it corresponds to whatever they've already laid down in their brains as being correct and feeling correct. But if you accept that all of this is predicated upon unprovable and often wrong hypotheses, such as that these young women are anxious, if you argue instead that they have a defect in their sinoatrial node, you'd have a whole different explanation for what they were experiencing. But you can only get there is if you step back from the word she's anxious and say she is experiencing, and then you list it like data. She's experiencing rapid heart rate and sweaty palms, and then it's chicken and the egg. And then so when you think about trying to advise people, somehow they have to get beyond what they believe to be correct, almost as though they were going to go on a mental retreat away from their own beliefs. That's very, very hard to do.
What do you think is the question we should be asking ourselves to open the door to that?
I think that one of the questions you can ask to start that is this a question for which there's an answer? I mean, that may sound stupid, but there is no answer as to whether or not we should have invaded Iraq. There are opinions, because you can't do a controlled study 100 times, 50 times you invade Iraq and 50 times you don't, you find the outcome, because it doesn't work like that. So the first question would be, is this something for which there is, by today's parlance, reasonable scientific evidence to support one position over another? If it's not, then you automatically are now in the world of opinion, for which everybody's neural circuitry is going to come up with different answers. There will be some that seem better than others, for it's better to give charity to others than it is to be a mass murderer. I mean, no one would deny that, and yet those are not evidence-based facts. For example, I was watching a program on the horrible poverty in Nigeria, and a lot of these young kids are not getting adequate nutrition. So with inadequate protein, they have lack of development of brain, and it's a condition called marasmus, and they will end up probably a blight on society in terms of being productive. So on the one hand, you want to feed them because it's tragic to see them starving. And on the other hand, by doing that, you're feeding the problem that you're trying to get rid of. Now, that's not that's not amenable to a specific evidence-based answer. So number one, I think you have to label everything as whether or not this is provable. If it's not provable and it's opinion, then you have to develop a different set of criteria. Then you can get down to, okay, not provable. Are there better experts and worse experts? Is there some way that some expert opinion is better than another expert opinion? Then you get down to, again, you're getting down to subjectivity. In which case, I think one of the best hypotheses is take the worst contrary opinion that you can think of and see if you can find any merit in it. And at least if you can, it will diffuse your sense that you are unequivocally right. It will say, well, even though I don't agree, I can see where there's another point of view. And if you do that, you ultimately would come to the point of view that for the vast majority of the things that human beings do, there are no right and wrong answers. They're just relative merits based upon your particular perspective. And so you can accommodate other points of view if you don't agree with them. You can say, I don't agree with that, but I do respect your right to have it.
So I'd love to come back to this, what you said about the brain's desire to go with what's tried and true, because I'm thinking about the work we do with leaders and how we need to be able to put some big bets on the future. We can't fall in the trap of de-risking everything before we're able to innovate and move something forward. Sometimes we have data that says, I'm 70% certain, but I don't know what's going to happen after I move this forward or run this test. What would be a good practice or a good mindset for a leader or an innovator to adopt to be able to place bets and move things forward when they don't have the feeling of knowing in a responsible, reasonable way?
And this gets down to another fundamental problem of modern life is that I majored in American studies and American literature in college. And then I became a neurologist. There's like two poles, opposite poles, right? But what you're really asking is there some role for the humanities, meaning novels, theater, art, whatever, in giving us another way of thinking about rightness and wrongness? And for example, if you read a novel, you can see whether or not it feels true and correct to you, even though it's not true and correct in the same visceral sense that, it may be the same in the visceral sense, but not in an actual sense as proving that, let's say, that cholesterol causes heart disease. They're not the same kind of thing, and yet we tend to dismiss touchy-feely stuff that's taught by the humanities, and as a result, they've fallen completely out of favor. If I were asked to recommend something, I would ask everybody to try and write a short story or a poem. I was asked to write for Cambridge, a quarterly journal on bioethics, and they wanted me to write the usual medical stuff, and I said, no, thank you. They said, well, what would you like to do? I said, well, I think I would like to write short stories or poems, because I think you expose yourself to your own inner feelings in a way where you might get a sense of whether that's right or wrong. And so a year or two ago, I wrote a poem that was, believe it or not, was in the American Academy of Neurology. In fact, I've done several for them, in which I wrote a poem about a group of brains in jars sitting in an autopsy suite talking to each other. And I wrote this poem. One of the things that came out was they were all resentful that they hadn't imagined an afterlife. Now, I am a complete non-believer. I have no idea where that came from. But every time when I read that poem now, I recognize that there's some part of me that is irrationally mystical. Do you follow me? But it's in the poem. It wasn't in, I didn't write this with the idea of doing anything. And when these brains are talking to each other, it was another reality. And now it sounds odd, but I got all kinds of people responding to that. And they respond in a different way than they do to somebody arguing about the presence or absence of God or afterlife, or that the soul is a neurologic construct, etc. And so you ask me about what I would do. I would try somehow to get people to experience themselves in a way that they don't have to justify. If you follow me. In other words, where you're not responsible for what you say in the sense that they're going to hold you to it, but at the same time, you see yourself from a different perspective.
So deepening this,
love that.
yeah, I mean, this is really interesting. So, but what it provokes in me is that we often are having this conflict between objective knowing and subjective knowing. That you don't pull those two things apart, because one feels slightly shameful and tied up in your own identity, which is, this feels
Right.
true to me, but I have no way of proving it, and therefore, I'll feel something negative when that's confronted with, and so I then try to mask that or dress it up with some objective truth, which isn't very credible in its own right, but the thing that making me feel I'm certain around
Right.
it. So that leads to bias and blind spots and so on. So, from your experience in all of this, what's the way in which you help others to pull those two things apart, the sense of knowing that's subjective and objective?
I think in part it would be to, as I mentioned, would be to label as clearly as you can the likelihood that this could lead to a single correct answer. In other words, if something could lead to a single correct answer, then you pursue it as a degree of certainty. But if it could never lead to a single correct answer, then you shovel it off into the opinion category. A good example is in this mass murder they had a couple days ago. Shortly afterwards, you heard on all the TV networks, shortly we will figure out the underlying motivation. Really? I mean, that's an impossibility, because you're asking for steps that the killer knows why he did what he did, and that even if he did, he could tell you, and that you could trust him. I mean, the multiple. So if you were to think about that as an analogy, you'd say, well, imagine if somebody does XYZ, creates a product, wants to fire somebody, wants to create a new board of directors of a company. Think of all the steps that the killer, between him doing the act and you knowing why he's doing it. Well, in the same way, when you have corporate affairs, or people ask questions for which they really don't know the likelihood they could even find an answer. They don't even know what it is they're looking for that would represent something that you could quantify as a 10% or a 90%. So the first thing would be to ask yourself, is there something that which in some way you could quantify? If not, if this is completely off limits, then we will then put all of them on a bulletin board and ask for another way of thinking about it. But in so doing, recognize that your feelings about it are irrelevant. They're just plain irrelevant. Feelings of certainty just don't work there.
If you're new to the Evolving Leader podcast, please subscribe to us on your favorite platform. We have many more thought-provoking and inspiring guests coming up this season that you won't want to miss. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, please leave us a review. Thanks for listening.
I love this quote. Reason is not disembodied as the tradition has largely held, but arises from the nature of our brains, bodies, and bodily experiences. So I'm curious, what has the experience of the last year with COVID had on you personally, and any impact on your perspective about how people, think about the conclusions they come to?
Several thoughts. One of which is, as I'm getting older and I see this is going to last for a while, and I've been home for a year, getting older, and at the same time asking myself, what is I really want to do? One of the things you first examine is your sense of commitment. Now, when you're 20 years old and you see an infinite horizon, you can conceptualize wasted time. But as you get older, not only is that harder to do, but you recognize you have flagging energies as well as decreased available time. So you start to say, what is truly important? And then you ask yourself, what created the me, the I, as you said, that made me an underachiever? And whatever it was is waning now as I get older. And then I was thinking, well, the other day I was supposed to be writing something, but it's beautiful this time of year, and the birds are all out there singing, and there are these red-tailed hawks that live outside the house, and they're doing all these aerial maneuvers out front of the house. And An hour passed, and I said, geez, I'm either very, very old, like in all these farts who sit on a park bench and watch the birds, or this is wonderful in its own regard. And I thought, you don't have to have a commitment in the same way as long as you can come to peace with a different way of thinking. And I think most people take a childhood view of life and expect it to last your entire lifetime. But it doesn't last an entire lifetime. You lose your ambition, your dopamine levels may rise and fall, and testosterone, this, that, and the other thing. And a new you keeps emerging. And so what I've actually seen, and seen in my friends as well, is that we all feel differently from before. Partly related to the COVID, but partly related to the fact that we've had a year just to be by ourselves. And that's changed a lot of the goals for people. A lot of my friends who have been successful and what writers, it's changed how they see the world, probably permanently. And in some ways, I think it's for the best. I don't mean the COVID's for the best, mind you, but I think it's for the best because I think you get, because once you think that you are who you created for yourself, like you believe in that narrative. And a good example of this is before this happened, you think in terms of, well, I've got to do X, Y, and Z over the next 3 weeks, 6 weeks, 12 weeks. And then suddenly you can't do any of that. And then what you realize is the narrative that you created for who you are and how you have self-respect and self-esteem and community recognition or whatever it is that you like have all been yanked away. And now you're just alone. You're alone with your wife, in my case, alone with my wife here at home. And none of it made any difference. So to me, it's been an opportunity to step back from the fray and recognize the extent to which the person that I thought was me, it was just a narrative that I had built up in the past that isn't working as well anymore, but it's being replaced by a new one that I'm not writing, but it's the birds are writing it for me in the sense when I watch them, it's okay too. So I think it's the recognition among successful people, whatever that means, that there are other ways of living a life, but they don't necessarily require you planning them out because that's the way the old we work. It's a matter of accepting what is. And so this has been a year of acceptance in a way, which is really hard to express any other way.
So good.
Scott and I have been having similar conversations because we are both fairly driven individuals as well, and like to do lots, accomplish lots, and we've had to pivot in that whole thing and come to that new acceptance. And I wonder in terms of what does that do to society? When more people are coming to that new accommodation of things, will it get snapped back immediately, or do you think it will create some sort of evolutionary impulse in society?
I'm not sure why most people do what they do. Okay, for reasons I've already mentioned. And I'm not sure what normal means, which is something that seems to have gone by the wayside. And do I think that something new will arise out of this? Depends on whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic. If you require continuous rewards of the old you, nothing will change. If you can enjoy the concept of a new you, things might change. Now, I've known lots of people, obviously, by my age, and I've seen occasionally people who have had a major change in their life values and circumstances. Most people don't change. When they keep talking about going back to normal. Well, the normal wasn't working very well in America before that. Well, why wouldn't you just say, well, hold it a minute. This is an opportunity for something new. I just as an aside, are you familiar with this group called the Institute for the Future? Yes. Okay, so I used to go down there and give them little talks and so on. But I found that people were still trapped in their old business frameworks. It just couldn't, they would think short term. And I found it out after a while, it wasn't terribly fruitful for me to people who were unwilling to take a leap. Not all of them, but most people. And corporate people are constrained by a lot of bottom lines that I'm not constrained by. And I have to recognize that.
Well, let's just dig into that for a moment, because, we are constantly harangued by the need for more innovation, more disruptive thinking, more long-termism, and so on. Give us a sense of what you experienced there and what's standing in the way of being able to think like that. When you talk about this leap, being able to make a leap into the unknown.
I'll speak by analogy. I'm contemplating in the concept of hopelessness, not as a negative, but as a positive. So, and I may or may not have told you the story, but it's worthwhile because I have a friend who lives just down the street from me. We went to grammar school, high school together. We drank in college, Okay, I've known him all my life. And he's a very successful businessman. So we were having lunch, and I mentioned to him that my lab partner from the one college chemistry class I did take, won the Nobel Prize in medicine for his research advances in cancer. And then he died of pancreatic cancer. And my friend, without missing a beat, looked at me, how could he die? He knew everyone. And I said, well, it doesn't work like that. You can't think in terms of this is good or bad. Pancreatic cancer is one of the things for which there's no, and he says, well, what can I do to prevent it? Explain to him that, you should embrace hopelessness. And so I started thinking about what hopelessness meant. And probably one of the best examples is hard love. If you got a kid who's a rebellious teenager, nothing you've done works. No matter how you talk to them, everything goes south. And now you're at a point where you're desperate. You don't want them in the house as is or her, whatever. You don't know what to do. And you go to a therapist, and the therapist says the only thing that we can do is involuntarily commit your child for rehab, and that's really hard love. Now you're at a crossroads. To not admit that things are hopeless is to commit yourself to hopelessness. To admit that it's hopeless as is allows you to maybe come up with an alternative. So you do hear about people that go to rehab and get better, despite the fact that, it was horrible getting the people to get there. It was heartbreaking for everybody. And when I look at modern society now, I recognize that most of our communications have broken down. And I wrote a piece for Eon magazine about migration a year or two ago, which pointed out that given the climate warming in closer to the equator and the unequal birth rate, as you get closer to the equator, more children, that it's inevitability that you're going to have migration pressures in the same way as you have reverse osmosis. You're going to go from more compact so they're going to move. So migration could be seen as a physical reaction to oppressive climate and overpopulation. Well, it's really hard to accept that this is going to get worse, but hard love would say, wait a minute, this is going to be worse. So you take a look at the statistics surrounding popular beliefs. For example, we believe that education, being a super liberal, I believe that education is the way to make everybody more equal. But we've seen what's happened in the last 50 years in America, at least in terms of their scoring on exams. People haven't done any better in math. We're not even near the top in terms of educational abilities and any of the things that you can measure. And it's gotten worse. Well, wouldn't it be better to admit that it's gotten worse than to continue with the old line thing? We'll just do it better. We just try harder. We'll do it. And that, to me, it's admitting defeat that might be the thing that will save the world in a way. Admitting that things need to go through a hard love process. So I don't know. To me, that's something that I've been thinking a lot about. I think that requires actually throwing up your hands in despair as the only form of hopefulness. Now that's really an odd way to phrase it.
So fascinating. Makes a ton of sense too.
Because otherwise we're going to continue what we're already doing. And so, in terms of if I were instructing young kids or whatever, I suppose it would be to imagine the worst case scenario. What if this is not going to get better, whatever it is, whether it's a disease you have, or you're not going to do better in school, or you're not going to do better playing tennis, or you're not, what would you do? And maybe facing it directly is better than pretending that it's not so. Because the narrative of your life, the narrative of people around you might be more flexible. I don't know. It's just a wild thought.
Well, certainty in that circumstance blinds you to that reality, and then it's too late. You have no options. You've run out. Run out of, and that happens to so many organisations because they're in a kind of defence mode around the thing that they've created in the past. And I suppose that's the same for an individual's identity. You know, this is who I am. This is who I've always been. And you know, COVID means I can't have this, so I cling on to that sense of self and identity rather than acknowledging that it's all gone. It's all stripped away. And I think I love the cleansing effect of COVID in some respects, in that it's taken out all of those certainties and all of the habitual patterns that we're in and allowed more people to kind of go, is that really what I wanted out of life? To spend every weekend shopping or, you know, doing this kind of thing or that kind of thing in my work, and actually reassess it. It's given us a chance to assess that. But the question, I guess, is how many people have recognized the hopelessness of their situation.
And you know, it's not unpleasant to feel that.
One final question for me: as you look at your students, have you seen through the generational shifts any difference in how certainty works with different generations? And I'm thinking just about students, or is it pretty consistent?
I think I haven't seen that there's been any difference. In other words, the opposite of certainty would be open-mindedness. I suppose there is a subcategory of people that feel that being open-minded is certainly the best way to be. I mean, in some sort of distorted feeling of it. So there's a certain pleasure in postmodern. All thoughts are valid and equal. But I think that's a minority viewpoint. I will tell you that I did an interview last week with a youngish man, by my standards, from Korea, and we were talking for a bit, and then he said, "You know, I feel really lost." And I said, "Why is that?" And he said, "Because, you know, I look around me and people have been so indoctrinated or maybe addicted to the internet and social media and video games in Korea and so on." He said that I can't communicate. He said, "I've found that communication amongst my peers, I can't communicate with them because they have adopted a new set of values that I can't accept." And it was actually, I was kind of sad listening to him because I recognized that I don't know that opinions are, to me, I don't know that opinions are based on thoughtful regard to all things. Social media is a form of accepting opinion, even if you don't recognize it. It is a subliminal indoctrination. I don't see people struggling against that. I see them arguing from Instagram and Facebook and all these other things the same way they always did. And I may be wrong, but I think they accept it. It's a different form of certainty. They pick their group and they stick with their group. So that's my pessimism. What's that?
I think you're right. I see it too.
And you know, I did it many years ago when I first wrote this book. Somebody asked me about how I felt about social media, and I don't do much of it. In fact, I don't do any of it. And she was telling me that a lot of people have 500 friends. Well, first of all, that's an impossibility. If you have 500 friends, you don't have any. But she was saying that for many people that they enjoyed early on in this, the bell going off saying, "You've got mail." And it suddenly struck me that it was very much like a rat experiment, where they're rewarded with the ringing of a bell and they continue to do it ad nauseum. Well, for me to think that people have changed, or have moved away from someone else telling them how to think and react, you'd have to show me people who are leaving social media and the internet. I don't see that. I mean, it would have to be an actual abandonment that would suggest that these people actually are trying to think for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Robert, where do you feel your work is going for the remainder of the next few years? What are the things that you are really passionately interested in right now?
I think I think that I've come to the end of the line in believing that pure reason is likely to affect any major social. Conversely, I think that what is needed is a recognition of how we got to this point in history where we have certain ideas about what represents a human being in terms of his overall behavior. What, for example, is empathy primarily a biologic trait that's beyond your control? Can empathy be learned? Can open-mindedness be learned? Well, these are questions for biology, and perhaps they're influenced by language, but also I think it would be nice if we could figure out a way to communicate with each other, recognizing that there's a fundamental defect in our communication. And how you overcome that really is a matter of accepting that whatever you experience about certainty, whatever you experience about your beliefs and moral values arises out of something that is truly idiosyncratic as opposed to being right or wrong. And if we could see each of ourselves as a fictitious process, by that I mean, you tell yourself, when I was in high school, I played tennis and I was allegedly pretty good. In retrospect, watching these other guys play now, I was terrible. Okay, I admit you were terrible. Don't continue with the narrative that you were a great tennis player. Just fess up. You were okay for your time, but terrible in today's, right? Which means stepping back from reason to accept the way you see yourself are stories that you can modify if you can get to where they're generated. But in order to get to where they're generated, you've got to be willing to relinquish defensiveness and all of the traits that are allegedly necessary for self-esteem, which leads you to the question about what is self-esteem and so on. So each one of these are questions that peel down to another level about basic human behavior and an acceptance of the extent to which we've told ourselves stories that don't work. And I think what we're seeing now in the world is stories that don't work, but we are afraid to let them go because we don't know what to replace them.
Wow. Well, I had a feeling of knowing this was going to be an amazing interview, and now I'm certain that it was. Dr. Burton, thank you so much for giving us so much to think about and so much of your time. This has been really a treat. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And to our listeners, as always, the world is evolving. Are you?